So thank you for the organizers who put this wonderful conference together. I wish I could have been there the whole time in person, but alas, other things held me back here. And certainly congratulations to everybody for forming the new Erich Fromm Society of North America. It was a lot of work on a lot of people's part, so it seems to have turned out very well. I look forward to working with you all and develop and preserve and transcend Erich Fromm's work. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is Erich Fromm and the problem of oikophobia. Oikophobia is something that I've been witnessing more and more, especially in the field of psychoanalytic political theory as well as in political philosophy. It's quite a pernicious problem that has been really creeping up more and more in the leftist academic circles. And the history and meaning of the term oikophobia is oikos is Greek for home, phobos, of course, for fear. And as a psychological pathology, it's the actual fear of home, family, everything that's familiar. But as a psychopolitical pathology, it is a fear of all that is ours. And what I mean by ours in this sense is everything that is our civilization, our culture, our history, even to a certain extent our ethnicity. In practice, it's an abandonment of the Western heritage and legacy and tradition as it's practiced on the left, as well as a form of self-loathing. It was introduced into contemporary philosophy by the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton in 2004 in his book England and the Need for Nations. Scruton thought it was a youthful phenomenon that eventually would go away with the maturation process of each individual. So when you're young, you're disgruntled, you see what's wrong in your society, but as you get older, you start to appreciate the benefits of your society, the goods of your society. It tends to be a factor, according to Scruton, in societies where their external enemies are vanquished. So as long as there's no outside threat, people turn on themselves. They oppose each other. Our antagonisms become internal as opposed to external. However, it's increasingly becoming a significant stream, as I said, among leftist academics and intellectuals and activists as well. To oikophobes, nothing in the West or parts of the West that they're particularly interested in are redeemable. There is only abstract negation of the legacy of the West, not a dialectical engagement with it. And I'll give you a couple examples of a couple that I've experienced personally. Last year I was presenting at a conference in Oxford, and we were discussing the problem of German guilt as a inherited form of guilt that's passed down to each generation. And I was critical of the way that the Holocaust is taught in German schools, and I made that point, and I had some agree with me, some disagree with me. But after our discourse, I had a young German scholar came to me and she said, I was horribly offended by what you had to say about Germany. And I asked her why. I mean, what was so offensive about it? And she said, we are not guilty enough. We do not feel guilty enough. And then she said something which was beyond societal issues. She said, we are more guilty today than they were who did it. I didn't quite know what to say, and for me, I was quite shocked at that. You know, you would think that the people who were sat in the Nuremberg trial would be more guilty than generations later, but to her, today's Germans are more guilty. I mean, her relationship to Germany and all things German was colored by the self-persecution, the self-loathing, the self-contempt for all things German. And so when I said to her, and then we get to another form of oikophobia, when I said to her, well, you know what Freud said about guilt? And she immediately stopped me and she said, well, we know what Freud said about women, so we don't have to listen to him. And it was completely repudiation of Freud, repudiation of anything having to do with the idea that inherited guilt was a problem. And this was a form of oikophobia that I saw practiced from her presentation later on. Another thing, you know, problematic. In philosophy, Hegel says at one point in time that women have an inability to do philosophy because they can't think abstractly. They only think in pictures and pragmatism. And so the question becomes there, do we get rid of all of Hegel? Do we abstractly negate all of Hegel and Hegel's corpuses of work? Or do we have a dialectical engagement with Hegel? For the oikophobe, he has to be canceled, right? He's no good. He said this horrible thing back in the 1800s. He's of no use. Another scholar told me recently that Hegel had criticized Africa for being without history. I don't think she really knew what he meant by it, but she took it in a certain way, and therefore, again, no Hegel. Hegel's persona non grata. Aristotle, for instance, also believed that some people were fit for slavery, and they would never get out of that condition because they were mentally enslaved people. And therefore, I even had a student, when they read that and they brought that up, they said, we can't read Aristotle. He's done. He's canceled. He's out. Non-dialectical colonization theory or decolonization theory. I write a lot about decolonization. I published a book recently on decolonization, but non-dialectical decolonization is the West colonized, therefore the West has nothing redeemable about it. And this is the mirror opposite of what the Malay theorist Syed Hussein Alatas called the captive mind, wherein those who are subject to colonization see all things Western through the eyes, or all things Western as good. And it's not good because it's qualitatively good, it's good because it's Western. And so this is the opposite. All things Western are bad, not because it's qualitatively bad, but because it's Western. And so the psychology of oikophobia, which is what I'm really working through right now, is, that all thinking people are critical of their own societies, their cultures, their civilizations. We have a lover's quarrel with our civilization, with our country. I know I certainly do with my own. And without such a quarrel, one becomes nationalistic, becomes civilizational chauvinists, etc. However, oikophobia can become pathologized, much like xenophobia, people who are pathologically prone to hating the other. In this sense, oikophobia is a pathological means or a way, a worldview of hating the self or oneself. And as a pathology, it becomes the dominant lenses through which one sees the world, and that has a sadomasochistic element to it. So it is the persecution of the self, which in many ways brings about jouissance, brings about some sort of happiness, some sort of feeling of liberation, also a feeling of power. It has a sadistic component. It attempts to humiliate, disgrace, and belittle the West and Westerners and anyone who would say, well, anything positive about the West. And so it attempts to shame or cause pain to those who value the Western heritage and legacy, even in a dialectical fashion. It gives the bearer of oikophobia a sense of power, a sense of belonging to something that is a powerful movement that they can somehow undo or somehow shame away, all the good, bad, and the ugly from the West. And it brings about pleasure to degrade the West, right? And last but not least, it's a form of virtue signaling. Let's be honest. I am not part of this group over here, these Westerners who are the bearers of all these horrible things that have been done in the world. Certainly is the case, right? So xenophilia, which often accompanies oikophobia, is a means of intellectually and emotionally escaping the night side of Western history. And one can claim to be on the moral high ground and thus leave behind all that is negative in the Western history and tradition and culture, and still remain part of that history, tradition, and culture. In that sense, it's an intellectual cop-out in the sense that it escapes the hard work of dealing with the Western heritage. And so, going to what Daniel said, in many ways, it also reflects an overactive superego and ressentiment. Now, Benedict Beckold's book, Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia, and the Decline of Civilizations, this book here, is one of the few things that have been written about this. And he's a conservative philosopher, did his studies in Heidelberg. It's quite interesting. He has many good points. His ideas of the Frankfurt School is anemic at best, and he leaves Fromm out completely. But Beckel sees oikophobia as an aspect of the decline of the West. For me, it's more indicative not of the decline of the West, but the decline of the left. So the West is still predominantly a powerful liberal project, I mean, even in its neoliberal form. While it's often shaken up, it still holds solidly in place. Of course, there's major challenges to it. Russia's neo-Eurasianism is a challenge to it. That has faltered and doesn't have much of a chance. China may be the only real substantive opposition to liberal dominance. But while his critique is mainly one-dimensional on the Frankfurt School, it goes against Marcuse. He doesn't address Erich Fromm at all. And he seems to believe that the Frankfurt School is one of the core reasons of why you have oikophobia, especially in the younger generations, that the critique of the West, that not being able to see anything good in the West, comes directly from the Frankfurt School. And that's certainly not the Frankfurt School that I've studied and that I work with, and certainly not the case for Erich Fromm. So moving to Fromm, of course, has a dialectical approach to the legacy of the West, a determinate negation approach, Aufhaben, right? More than any other, Erich Fromm was well aware of the dialectical nature of the Western world. He understood what Hegel called the West's Golgotha history, especially through his own flight from Nazism and anti-Semitism. He understood the realities and dangers of the authoritarian personality, especially when provoked by a demagogue. And he understood the dangers of the nuclear-armed Cold War, the military-industrial complex. He understood and worked actively against, in many cases, these very dangerous and destructive elements of the West. In his writing on antiquity, the medieval world, Renaissance, modernity, he's acutely aware of the negativity of Western history and its tendency towards violence, its necrophilic characteristics, its destructiveness. And yet, and this is the dialectical part, and yet, despite all of its ugliness, he did not collapse into oikophobia or xenophilia. His method, like the rest of the Frankfurt School, was determinate negation as opposed to abstract negation. Surely, he would disagree with Hegel that women can't do philosophy. He would see it from the historical reality that women weren't allowed to do philosophy. And now, of course, with women's liberation, that women can do philosophy and psychoanalysis and everything else that men have held on to for themselves. But he would not cancel Hegel, right, for such an intellectual blunder. He wouldn't get rid of them, and he wouldn't say it's hopefully tainted. He disagreed mightily with Freud, yet he maintained many of Freud's insights, expanded on others, created new concepts with these Freudian roots. Despite the ugliness of Western thought and praxis, he remained firmly rooted within the Western intellectual tradition. However, he brought into that tradition, brought it into conversation with non-Western thought, especially Buddhism. So we have an issue of following Fromm or not following Fromm, right? The danger in not following Fromm's dialectical method towards the legacy of the West is twofold. Number one, we lose contact with our own resources in the West, resources that we need to create a more biophilic future. We on the left, and I say that as a general left, right, hand the entire storehouse of Western knowledge to the far right, who will weaponize it and use it against the anatopists, the people who they think should not be here, right? So it's not a matter of that they're racially inferior or this or that, but they ought not to be here, right? But we can't hand that whole intellectual tradition over to the far right, who will use it, of course, in the old Spartan way of xenolasia or remigration, pushing the people out, because they will do that, right? So if I were to say among most of my leftist friends, let's talk about the Bible, let's look into the Bible, my God, I would be thrown out. They wouldn't want to hear it, right? Whether it's the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, the Bible is persona non grata. It's passé, unless you're Roland Bohr, a great scholar of critical theory and the Bible. But outside of him and a few others, you mentioned the Bible among leftists, it's wrong. This is it. It's full of these horrible things. We don't talk about it as passe. It belongs into the infancy of humanity. But think about Fromm. Did Fromm not look at the Bible? Did Fromm not constantly go back to the Bible? Did Fromm not constantly reinterpret the Bible? What kind of what kind of reaction would these same leftists today, in many cases, if you bring them Fromm's book, "You Shall Be as Gods," right? Or use the biblical language that Fromm often uses about the prophets and the priest, as Mayor was talking about earlier in this conference, right? When I bring into conversation this idea that Daniel talked about idolatry being the core of even Marxism, for Adorno, Löwenthal, and Horkheimer, the Bilderverbot, right, the image ban of the Decalogue, was at the core of critical theory, and they name it as literally the core of critical theory. Well, this is a biblical idea. This is a religious idea. Right, and that can't be held for the oikophobes. This is not something that they certainly want to talk about. It's something that's passe. It's tainted. So throughout the corpus of Fromm's work, he invokes, uses, and reinterprets the pantheon of Western thinkers. He does not abstractly negate them. Thus, this, in many cases, this presentation in the paper I'm working on about this very subject is a plea for my dear leftist brothers and sisters to re-engage with the Western canon, not in a chauvinistic way or Eurocentric way, right? The Proud Boys ways of being Western chauvinists, right? But in a form of relatedness, to use Fromm's language, that is open to the other, while also remaining deeply engaged with the West's own important resources in philosophy, in religion, in literature, in its culture, in its history. We have to contest those resources, not abandon them.